So now it's time to build a custom entity to deal with the data that we're going to be generating for our Scratchpad Notepad demo thingy. We need to start off by putting the entity class in the correct place. So let's just check where the user entity that we were working with earlier sits, and we can see from the path here that it sits in an entity directory directly below XF, given that it's an XF entity. But this is going to be a pad entity or a note entity, whatever we call it. It's a pad entity. So let's go into here and create a new directory called entities or entity, because that's the type of class we're creating, and then we'll have a new PHP class in there called note. And you'll see that this time it's created the namespace declaration for me automatically, which is great. I've actually got a shortcut here to create a sort of skeleton entity class, so I'm going to use that. And it just looks like this. There it is. I'll pull that in, and now I can just tab through. Now, what you can see here is we've got a static function called getStructure, and this is where we define the structure of the entity, funnily enough. And you can see that we tell it what the name of the table is going to be, the short name that we were using for the finder earlier on, and the entity manager as well. The content type, which is something that we'll touch on a little later. The primary key, that's how the entities know what their primary keys are. And then we've got a list of columns, relations, default widths, getters and betters, which behaviors even, which I'll go into shortly. But for now, let's just fill this out with the data we need. So the class is called note, and that's fine. The structure table is going to be demo note, because we're going to namespace the tables in addition to the templates like we did then. So demo underscore pad, and then the short name is going to be demo / pad note, which is all good. And then the content type is demo pad note. Primary key is note ID, and then we can go into here and see that the note ID is an unsigned integer, and it's set to auto increment. So that's all good. Now let's define some more fields. So let's just copy that one, and well, the notes have got to belong to someone. So we're going to have a user ID, and again that's going to be an unsigned integer, but this time I'm going to give it a default of the XF visitor, being the user who is currently logged in, user ID. Now, what have I done there? What this is going to do is, when we created our sort of empty entity earlier on with the entity manager, we didn't assign it any information initially. And so what it would do in those cases is it would populate the fields with the defaults. And so this is saying, if we don't specify the user ID, then default it to the user ID of the current visitor. So essentially, whoever's currently using it. We're also going to limit this to logged in users. So XF visitor user ID will always have a positive value. Right, let's go to the next one. Let's have, what are we going to need? Let's have a title field. And this time it's going to be a type string or str. We're not going to give it a default because that would be nonsense. So let's give it a max length of 255 characters, because we're going to be essentially calling this a varchar field in the database. And finally, I want to say that this is required because otherwise we'd be allowing people to create entities of this type that didn't have a title, and that would also be nonsense. Right, moving on. Let's have a content field. Content, and that again is a type string, but I'm not going to give it a max length at this point. You'll find out why shortly. And this is also required. And then let's have a date field. We'll just call it post date, and this is going to refer to the date and times, Unix timestamp, at which this content was initially created. So it's going to be an unsigned integer, and we're not going to expect people to put that in themselves, so we're going to use default again. and the default is going to be xf time, being the time at which execution started on this script. So that's all looking good. Anything else we should add? I know, let's add, just for the sake of illustration, let's add an edit date. And it's going to be exactly the same. It'll default to xf time when you first use it. In fact, let's not default it to that. Let's default it to 0. And 0 is going to mean that there have been no edits. Okay, that's looking good for the structure. Let's move on to relations, because obviously we do actually need this to be related to the user table, and we have to describe how that relation works. So we go into our relations array here, and we say that we want, let's see if I've got an entity relation shortcut. Entity, oh, I have, look at that. And there we go, it's user, the entity is xf user, the type is self to 1, meaning that there will be one item that refers to this user ID. The conditions are user ID, meaning that both tables have a user ID, and we should use that as the join condition. And it is a primary key, so that is the relation done. Now, let's just talk quickly about default with. If you remember back in the notes controller, we set these with parameters on the finder. Well, we don't actually have to do that. If we know that bringing back notes without a particular relation would be futile, or that we're going to be doing it almost all the time, then we can specify the relations that should be fetched by default using default with. So I'm going to say that whenever we return a demopad note entity, we also want to fetch the associated user. So we'll just name the relation in there. Having specified this edit date field that we've defaulted to 0 to indicate that there are no edits, we need a way to have that edit date be updated whenever there is an edit. And thankfully we have a function that is tailor-made for that sort of purpose, and it's called pre-save. So we're going to just define it here. And you can see that it's being automatically suggested because there's one in the main entity class that we're currently extending. So let's say yes to that and have it auto-generate. Now, we're going to take off that because in actual fact the pre-save function in the parent is empty. So we don't need to include the pre-save call there. But what we do need to do is to get the edit date updated if this is an edit. And in order to do that, we use a little function that's defined within the entity system called isUpdate. So let's, it looks a bit like this. If this is update, then we can do stuff that would only apply if we're not inserting a new record, if we're just updating an existing one. And all we have to do is say this edit date equals xf time. And so before we get to the point where it's actually going to do any saving, it will check to see if there's anything that needs to be done, like this edit date setting, set it and then do the save afterwards. So we will automatically have the edit date updated to the current time at any time that we save an edit. At this point, I do need to point out that I have completely messed up the short name for this entity. It should actually replicate the namespace, essentially. So what we should be looking at here is demo in title case, because that's what it says here, and then a backslash because it's a class path, and then pad in title case as well. So having fixed that, let's move on to the next issue that I've noticed, which is something that you will encounter yourselves, namely that this edit date that I've got here is currently being indicated as unknown. The IDE has underlined it to tell me that it doesn't understand that that's part of this class. But thankfully we have a tool to fix that. And if you remember back when we were working with the other entities and I told you to use phpdoc, the reason that that works is because the entities have a phpdoc descriptor. and we're going to generate that now automatically. So having built our structure here, we're going to open a terminal and we're going to run the following command. It is php command.php xf-dev entity-class-properties. And when I run that, I need to specify the name of that entity that we're going to apply it to. So we're going to take that one, including quotes, because otherwise that backslash is going to be escaped. And I'll run that, and it tells me that it's done it. Well, what's it done? Well, if we come back in here and allow it to refresh, we now have properly written PHP doc for the entire class, which is fantastic. So now it knows that edit date is an integer property of this class, and so it's not underlined as a potential problem anymore. Now let's talk a little more about some magic properties that entities have. And one of those is the ability to define in the structure the fact that we want to censor the title and the content. And by censor, I mean apply the standard system-wide Zen4o filter for words that we deem to be unacceptable. And it's as simple as this. We're just going to come in here and say censor is true. And that's it. By having that in the structure, then automatically as part of the validation and verification of the data for these when they get submitted, it will automatically apply the censor. And we'll get to see that a bit later when we actually start playing with some data. The next thing I want to show you is the automatic verification validation process that you can employ for each of the fields that you're being given when data is submitted for the entity. I've been trying to think of a sensible thing to demo here, and what I've come up with is we've got a maximum length for the title field here, but it would be good to specify that it must be a minimum length too. And so to do that, we just need to bring up a new function. It's going to be a public, I think it's a protected function actually. Yeah, protected function, and it's called verify, and followed by the name of the field. So verify title. And then we're going to pass into that the value of the field by reference. And then in here, we're going to do the actual validation. So all we'd need to do to get a minimum length is say if strlen of value is less than, let's say less than 10 characters, then we'll call an error and we'll say something like that. Naturally, you would want to use a phrase here rather than just default text, but for the purposes of the demo, text is fine. And then there's a second parameter here where we can tell it what the field that's being applied to is, and we're going to say that that is title. And then we'll return false, which will say that that is not valid. And then assuming that we don't run into that, then we'll return true, which means that the value has been validated as acceptable. Now, these verification functions are not limited solely to actually doing any verification. The reason that we have the value passed in by reference is that we can actually change the value if we want to. So what we could do here is after we've established that the thing is of a sufficient length, then we could do something to it, like let's ensure that it's coming through in title case. So we just say value equals UC words, or UTF-8 UC words on value, and then anything that comes through in all lowercase will automatically be capitalized at the first letter of every word. So we don't necessarily need to have a return false condition at all if all we want to do is just manipulate the data that's being submitted to us. Moving on slightly, I want to talk about getters. Right now, we know that we can fetch the note ID and the user ID and the title and all the other fields that come from the database, but a getter allows us to fetch more than that, to do something with the data or with something completely unrelated before it gets returned. And it works a little like this. First of all, we define the name of our getter, and I'm going to call this particular getter first word, and then the value of that needs to be true or false. And if it's true, it means that once it has been fetched once, it will cache the result and return the same result each time, which is usually what you want. So I'm going to set that value to true. And you just list your getters as name and value pairs in here. What will that do? Well, when I call note first word, it's going to look for a function to do something with that. And it looks like this. It's going to be a public function, and it's going to be accessed through array access. So essentially, PHP will look to see if there's a real property of the entity called first word, and if not, then it will try to call a function called get first word. And now we just need to actually return something. So all we need to do here is to return the first word of the content, for example. And the way I'm going to actually do that is to use explode, I guess. So let's return explode. Let's use the content. This content. Notice that it's been suggested as a field, as a property within the class because of the PHP doc that we wrote earlier. So that's great. We'll explode this content by spaces and return the first one, and that should give us the first word of the content, and we can call that as many times as we want, but it'll only actually do the work once it's done the work, it'll return the cached value. A nice thing about getters is that as far as someone working with the entity from an external perspective is concerned, there's no difference between the output from a getter and the output from an actual genuine database field. So if someone requests the first word from this entity, then it will be indistinguishable from an actual database field, with the only caveat being that if you try to set the value of a getter, then it's going to fall over. We can make the output of the getter appear to be a property of the class as far as external tools are concerned by updating the PHP doc. So just as we've got these properties for the columns and a property for the relation, we can also do properties for getters. And if we just go back to the terminal and run that command again, then not only will it update the PHP doc with any changes we've made to the structure or the relations, but it will also include any getters. And here we are, and it's telling me that we've got a mixed first word. Now you may be wondering why I've written all this code in the entity before I've actually got a database table to work with. And the reason is simple. Once I've defined the structure in the entity, Zen4o can actually generate the schema for the database table that it relates to automatically. And it looks like this. We'll just head off to the terminal again and run a command like this one, php command.php xf-dev generate schema entity, and then the name of the entity, which is this one. And there it is. Now, this isn't a raw SQL command because that's of limited use. What this is something for you to put into your setup script. So we'll just grab hold of that and copy it, and then move into our setup class. From here, all I've got to do is create the first step in my installation process, and it looks like this. It's a public function, and it's called install step 1, no parameters, and then I'm just going to paste in the schema commands that came from the terminal here, and you can see that it's calling the schema manager to create a table called demopad note, and then it has descriptions of the various columns that relate to what we just defined in the entity. So now we can save that out and come back to the terminal and actually do the work. And the command to actually run that install step manually as an add-on developer is as follows. It's php command.php xf add-on install step, and now the ID of the add-on. This is different from the class path here, which uses a backslash. The add-on ID, if you recall, uses a /. So it's demo/add-on pad. And then which step do we want to run? Well, it's step 1. So we'll just say yes to that, run it, and we've got a success message there that says install step 1 is finished. And if I come back to the database and refresh it here, you'll see that it has indeed created my demo pad note table. And there are the columns as defined in the entity. So I guess now we should check that this thing all works as we want it to and create some test data. So let's head back to our note controller here, and we've still got this post finder that's doing the stuff that is running behind there. But let's create a new note entity and give it some data and then save it. So note equals this entity manager create, and the short name is demo/pad::note. And then we can start to assign some data. So note title equals this is my first note title. And you'll notice that we are underlined here because there's a potential problem. It doesn't know what note actually is at this point. So let's help it out with some PHP doc. It's a demo pad entity note. And now it's not underlined, it understands what it is. In fact, we can even see that it's a string and it's declared in demo pad entity note. Right, let's carry on and add some content. So now we want note content equals here is the content of my first note. That'll do. And then we can say note save. So this is just a very basic save of a note entity. So let's go and refresh this here. And what we should find is that having executed all of that, we should be able to go into the data, and there it is. There's my first note. And we should take note at this point of the note that the title has indeed been converted to title case. So where we had the actual string we passed it was only uppercase on the first letter of the line, the UCWords function that was part of verify title has executed and given us title case. The post date is set to the Unix timestamp that the thing was created, and edit date is defaulted to 0 as we would hope. So I think we can call this a success. We do have a working entity that can save some data. So now let's work on getting an editor working.